Breaking news, family. Imagine this. You walk into the United Nations, the so-called House of Justice, and they hand you a stack of papers. 12 pages. Not your words, not your truth, just a script telling you to kneel. Read it, apologize, stay quiet, or lose everything. That was the trap set for Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso. But what happened next? It wasn't submission. It was defiance. Traoré didn't just rip up their script, he flipped the table on the entire system. He looked the world in the eye and said, "Africa will not bow." And that one moment, in front of hundreds of nations, sparked a movement stretching from Ouagadougou to New York, from the Caribbean to the Pacific. This isn't just politics, it's a global turning point. And tonight, we're breaking it down chapter by chapter, showing you how one speech shook the entire planet. So, stay locked in. Hit that like button, subscribe right now, and drop your city in the comments because this is a story every voice needs to amplify. Picture this. A young African president, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, walks into the United Nations, and they hand him a stack of papers. Not just any papers, 12 pages, neatly typed, full of words that were never his. Words designed to sound polite, diplomatic, responsible. But underneath, it was nothing more than a script of surrender. They called it an apology. 4 pages of saying sorry for his tone. 3 pages of saying sorry for his language. 5 pages reminding him to reaffirm shared values. Whose values? Certainly not the values of Africa. This wasn't an apology, it was a leash. A performance to show the world that once again, Africa knows how to bow. And here's the catch. They didn't just want his signature at the bottom. They wanted the image, the video, the headlines. Traoré apologizes. They needed the optics of obedience, the picture of a young African leader stepping back in line. Why? Because a few weeks earlier, Traoré had done the unthinkable. He spoke too loudly. He called out Israel's actions in Gaza, he named France as a destabilizer, and he warned the world that Africa's silence would make it complicit. For the West, that was crossing the line. So when they handed him those 12 pages, it wasn't about peace. It was about precedent. Because if the boldest African voice could be tamed, every other leader on the continent would get the message, speak carefully or be forced to kneel. But here's what the world didn't see. As Traoré looked at those 12 pages, he wasn't thinking of survival. He wasn't thinking of partnerships. He was thinking of the millions back home, the farmers in the Sahel, the mothers in Mali, the students in Lagos, waiting for someone to prove that dignity isn't negotiable. And that's when he made a choice. He folded the script in half. He would not play their theater. Not this time. Now, let's move into the shadows. 3 days after Traoré received that so-called apology script, his personal phone rang. Not the official line in the palace, not the secure channel monitored by staff. No, his personal phone. The one only 5 people on Earth were supposed to have. It was 2 in the morning in Ouagadougou. On the other end, a calm American voice. "Mr. President, this is Ambassador Richardson from the State Department. We need to talk." 20 minutes later, a black SUV rolled up to the palace gates. No flags, no diplomatic plates, no press. Just a quiet knock on the door of Africa's youngest head of state. Richardson didn't come alone. 2 men stepped out with him, men who never gave their names, never smiled, never even shook hands. They weren't diplomats, they were shadows. Inside Traoré's office, the ambassador opened a leather briefcase and spread out documents like playing cards. Satellite photos of Burkina Faso's gold mines, Chinese infrastructure deals, Russian advisors, Iranian medical contracts. "We know everything," Richardson said quietly. "And right now, we're choosing to call it cooperation instead of what it really is." The message was clear. We see you. We track you. And we can destroy you. Most leaders would have flinched. But Traoré leaned back, steady, and asked, "When America invaded Iraq, did you apologize first? When France intervened in Mali, did they ask Africa's permission? When Israel bombed schools in Gaza, do they draft apology speeches?" The ambassador had no answer. He closed the briefcase and muttered, "You're a smart man, Mr. President. Make the smart choice." When the SUV disappeared into the night, Traoré called his security chief. "How many Western operatives are in our capital?" 17 confirmed. Probably double unconfirmed. "And our phone lines?" "All tapped." "Good," Traoré said. Tomorrow, leak a story that I might actually read their apology. Because while Richardson thought he'd delivered a warning, Traoré had just set a trap. This is where the story takes a sharp turn. The West thought they had Traoré cornered. They believed their pressure worked, that the tough young captain from Burkina Faso had finally realized he was outmatched. But what they didn't know was that the real game had just begun. The morning after that midnight meeting, whispers began to leak. Anonymous sources claimed Traoré was reconsidering his position. Journalists in Paris started writing cautious headlines. Burkina Faso leader open to compromise. CNN ran a segment suggesting he might soften his tone to save vital partnerships. Washington insiders told each other, "Our campaign is working." But those whispers weren't accidents, they were seeds, planted deliberately by Traoré's own team. His security chief had carried out the president's orders to the letter. Feed the surveillance lines false information. Let Western embassies believe the script was back on the table. And the beauty of it? The West fell for it instantly. They started patting themselves on the back. They thought the storm had passed. Champagne glasses clinked in quiet corners of power. The narrative was shifting in their favor, or so they thought. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré was preparing something entirely different. His real speech was locked away, guarded like a state secret. His advisors knew fragments, but only he carried the full weight of what was coming. Outwardly, he let the world think he was bending. Inside, he was sharpening the blade. This wasn't just politics, it was classic Sahel strategy. Warriors from this region have always known how to lure their enemies into false confidence before striking. Traoré wasn't compromising. He was staging the greatest deception of his career. And as the world's media relaxed, as diplomats smiled and whispered problem solved, they had no idea that the young president was about to detonate a political earthquake right in the heart of New York City. Because in this chess match, while they celebrated a victory, Traoré was already several moves ahead. While the West was busy congratulating itself, something very different was unfolding back home in Burkina Faso. In the heart of Ouagadougou, Revolution Square was overflowing. 50,000 people packed shoulder to shoulder, voices rising like rolling thunder across the city. That's why we call it Thunder at the Square. There were no paid organizers, no staged cameras. This was raw, spontaneous energy. Mothers carried their children on their backs, waving the national flag high. Young men beat on handmade drums until the ground itself seemed to shake. Students climbed light poles just to get a glimpse of the stage. Even the elders, leaning on canes, came out to stand tall for one reason: to hear what their president had to say. When Traoré appeared, the square erupted. Not like a politician walking on stage, but like a warrior stepping into battle. He raised his hand and the crowd hushed. Then his voice cut through the night air. They think Africa still begs for permission to speak. They think we will apologize for telling the truth. But I came here to tell you Burkina Faso does not bow. The reaction was electric. Chants broke out in every corner of the square. No apologies, no surrender. Women ululated, young men pounded their fists against their chests, and a chorus of voices echoed into the Sahel night. This wasn't just a rally, it was a referendum. A living, breathing vote of confidence from his people. Traoré wasn't just speaking to the crowd, he was sending a message across oceans, straight into the offices of Paris, Washington, and New York. You may control the headlines, but we control the hearts. That night something clicked. The people understood that this wasn't simply about a speech at the UN. It was about dignity. It was about proving that Africa's voice could not be scripted, could not be edited, could not be silenced. And in that moment, the crowd became more than spectators, they became soldiers of spirit, an unshakable wall of defiance. The West had their 12-page apology. Traoré had 50,000 voices thundering in unison. And when he finally left that stage, the people knew. Whatever storm was waiting in New York, their president was not going in alone. He carried the roar of a nation with him. The day finally came. New York City, the United Nations General Assembly. Delegates from over 100 countries sat in their seats, whispering, smirking, waiting. Cameras zoomed in on one man, the young president from Burkina Faso, the one they thought had been tamed, the one they expected to read their carefully written apology. But when Ibrahim Traoré stepped up to that microphone, he wasn't holding 12 pages of surrender. He carried nothing but his own words, and something even more powerful, a small, worn piece of fabric. Burkina Faso's first independence flag. A symbol passed to him days earlier by an old freedom fighter who had fought in 1960. He laid it on the podium, looked straight into the chamber, and began, "Before you ask me to apologize, let me ask you, how many times have you apologized to Africa?" The room froze. No shuffling, no coughs, just silence. Then he went further. Did Belgium ever apologize for the Congo? Did France ever apologize for massacres in Algeria? Did Israel ever apologize for training militias that tore our region apart? The questions weren't rhetorical, they were daggers, and each one landed. Traore wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and read aloud a message from a 12-year-old girl in Ouagadougou. "Mr. President, please don't let them make you small. We are proud to be African." Then he looked up and declared, "That child has more dignity than this entire assembly." Gasps, nervous glances, delegates shifting in their seats. And then the moment no one expected, Traore gave an apology, but not the one they wrote for him. "I apologize," he said, "that Africa stayed silent for too long. I apologize that our leaders once believed dignity was optional. But I will never apologize for defending my people, for rejecting occupation disguised as diplomacy, or for being African and proud." By then, note-takers had stopped writing. Some diplomats walked out. Others stared at their desks. Traore didn't care. He didn't come for applause. He came for history. And in that chamber, history was made. The moment Traore's words echoed through the United Nations chamber, the shockwaves didn't stop at those marble walls. They ripped across continents. What happened next wasn't diplomacy as usual, it was an earthquake. Just hours after the speech, African ambassadors rushed into an emergency meeting at the Ethiopian mission in New York. 43 diplomats, usually cautious, usually careful, sat around a long table. But this time the mood was different. They weren't talking about aid packages or trade agreements. They were talking about sovereignty, about revolution, about dignity. And before midnight, something historic was born: the New York Declaration. A document pledging that no African nation would accept conditional aid again, that no African leader would ever be forced to apologize for defending their people. For the first time in decades, unity wasn't just a slogan. It was written, signed, and sealed. Within 48 hours, 12 African presidents had already put their names on it. But the real tremors weren't happening in those rooms. They were in the streets. In Nairobi, students at the University of Nairobi organized Dignity Day. Thousands filled campus courtyards, chanting, "No apology, no surrender." Professors canceled classes to let the movement take over. In Lagos, market women set up barricades around stalls, refusing to sell imported goods from companies linked to Western exploitation. "If they want our food," one woman said to a local camera crew, "they pay us fairly or they don't eat." In Accra, musicians dropped a track overnight, sampling Traore's UN speech, blending it with drums and reggae bass lines. Within hours, it was blasting from taxis and street corners. The chorus? "Africa will not bow." And in Cape Town, walls once covered with ads were painted over with murals. Giant portraits of Sankara, Mandela, Nkrumah, and now Traore, connected by a chain of unbroken hands. Underneath, in bold red letters, "The Unbroken Chain." Social media exploded. The hashtag #NoApology trended not just in Africa but in London, Paris, even New York itself. For the first time, Western journalists weren't controlling the story, ordinary Africans were. Clips of Traore's speech went viral, stitched with videos of young people refusing exploitation, mothers singing lullabies of pride, children holding homemade signs. "We are not small." And while the world's elites were still debating what had just happened, Africa had already moved on from reaction to action. For years, Western powers used apologies to chain the continent, to make it look humble, grateful, dependent. But now, in a single night, that script had been ripped apart. The earthquake wasn't just in New York. It was in every African capital, every university, every marketplace. The ground had shifted, and nothing would be the same again. Because what Traore proved in that chamber was now echoing everywhere. Africa doesn't beg. Africa doesn't bow. And Africa will never apologize for its own dignity. The tremors from New York didn't stop in Africa. They crossed the Atlantic like a tidal wave, crashing into communities that had been waiting generations for a spark. And suddenly, Traoré's defiance wasn't just an African story, it was global. First came the Caribbean. In Port-au-Prince, Haiti's prime minister went live on national TV. "We are not beggars," he said, echoing Traoré almost word for word. Within days, Haiti announced it was walking away from World Bank structural programs. No more handcuffs, disguised as loans. The Dominican Republic followed. Then Jamaica. Then Trinidad and Tobago. One by one, the islands that had carried the weight of colonial chains declared they were done apologizing. Then Harlem lit up. Overnight, a mural appeared on 125th Street. Traoré's silhouette, painted in black and gold, stood against a blood-red map of Africa. Across the top, no apology given. Locals stopped, stared, and pulled out their phones. Within hours, the mural was trending worldwide. Radio hosts in New York played clips of Traoré's speech on air, calling him the first African president in decades to speak like Malcolm, like Martin, like Marcus Garvey. In Brazil, the Quilombo communities, descendants of escaped slaves, held marches under a new slogan in Portuguese: "Africa não pede desculpas, Africa doesn't apologize." Banners stretched across favelas, samba drums carried the rhythm, and voices rose in unison. Even in Australia, Aboriginal activists carried Traoré's words into their sovereignty protests. Pacific Islanders facing rising seas painted "No Apology" on fishing boats and village walls, declaring they too would not kneel to powers that poisoned their land and oceans. This wasn't just solidarity, it was synchronization. From Harlem to Havana, from Kingston to Kinshasa, the message was the same: dignity over comfort, sovereignty over submission. Western think tanks scrambled to respond, labeling it dangerous populism. But the truth was simpler. The people had found a voice they recognized as their own. The wave was unstoppable. And for the first time in living memory, the Black world Africa, the diaspora, the oppressed and the silenced, was speaking with one voice. A voice that said, "We will not apologize. Not now, not ever." 1 year after that fiery day at the United Nations, the world looked at Burkina Faso and saw something nobody expected: a nation standing on its own feet. No IMF lifelines, no World Bank blueprints, no Western experts telling farmers how to till their land. And yet the country had achieved the unthinkable: full food security. Fields once dismissed as too dry were overflowing because Burkinabe farmers trusted their own knowledge, not imported advice. Across Africa, the dominoes kept falling. 17 nations renegotiated mining contracts to keep wealth at home. 23 created sovereign wealth funds. 31 launched their own tech initiatives. 42 signed new trade deals with each other, bypassing Western middlemen completely. The African Continental Free Trade Area, stalled for years, suddenly had wind in its sails, driven not by diplomats in suits, but by the roar of ordinary people demanding sovereignty. But here's what mattered most. It wasn't just policy, it was psychology. Africans no longer walked into rooms apologizing for their existence. Students in Ghana, lawyers in South Africa, farmers in Kenya, all carried the same fire. The message was simple: dignity is not negotiable. And beyond Africa, the echo grew louder. Indigenous communities in the Americas, Aboriginal activists in Australia, islanders in the Pacific, all drew strength from a single line: no apology. One African president had cracked the code of global resistance. Traoré's UN speech wasn't the end of a story. It was the opening chapter of a manifesto, a new era where Africans refused to kneel, refused to beg, and refused to let foreign powers write their scripts. So when the history books are written, the 23rd of September 2025 won't be remembered as the day a president refused to apologize. It will be remembered as the day Africa declared, "We choose ourselves." Brothers and sisters, what we just witnessed isn't just politics, it's history in motion. From a 12-page apology script meant to break one man, to a speech that lit up an entire continent, Ibrahim Traoré showed the world something powerful. Africa will no longer apologize for existing. What started in a single chamber in New York has grown into a movement stretching from Ouagadougou to Harlem, from the Caribbean to the Pacific. Farmers, students, mothers, freedom fighters, ordinary people everywhere are standing taller, speaking louder, and refusing to bow. This is the new era. One where dignity is worth more than dollars, and sovereignty is not for sale. And here's the truth: this story isn't over, it's just beginning. The next chapter depends on us, on how loudly we carry this message, on how firmly we stand when they try to silence our voices again. So if you believe Africa deserves to speak without permission, hit that like button, share this story, and drop your city in the comments. Subscribe now and let the world hear you say it. No apology. No surrender.